Hi everybody. So last little mini lecture here. It's going to focus on neurodevelopmental disorders. This might be a longer one just because there's a lot to cover. So neurodevelopmental disorders is the umbrella term for a variety of school-related disorders and dysfunctions. Sometimes you'll just heard these called the learning disorders as well, which is why that's what I've termed this chapter. So dyslexia is the hallmark one we usually talk about. It's an inability to read, but there are many more beyond that. And it can be either developmental or acquired. So developmental is it has come since birth. It's sort of developed as the child developed. It's been there. Acquired is you've learned to read, everything's going well, and then you have some sort of brain damage, whether through injury, illness, something along those lines, and then you struggle to read after that. So about 5% of the school-age population does have a learning disability, and we do have some issues with assessing it. The way that it's typically defined, and again, it'll vary from district to district, which also makes this tricky, is that if a person is 2 years behind in academic progress, then they're classified as having a disability. We find them in older kids, and achievement tests vary from school to school, district to district, state to state. So we don't really have one overarching way to diagnose these. So these are the DSM-5 categories for neurodevelopmental disorders. Intellectual disability is impairment that affects functioning in conceptual, social, and practical domains. So this is what we used to call mental retardation. We now refer to as intellectual disability, because it's more accurate and more patient-friendly term. Communication disorder is problems in verbal and nonverbal communication. Autism spectrum disorder we'll talk about in a lot more detail. You have impairment in social interactions, repetitive behavior patterns, also some other problems. ADHD is a common one to talk about. So you have problems with attention to detail, attention in general, also with hyperactivity. And then specific learning disorders, again, dyslexia is the one we typically think of, but you can also have disorders in writing, arithmetic, and mathematical reasoning. Dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia are the three that we typically talk about. So here are the symptoms that are generally associated with those disorders. And as you can see, there's a whole host of different things that do come into play. Now, we're talking about dyslexia first, and indeed just reading in general is often a struggle for people with these neurodevelopmental issues. So you can have phonological reading, and this is where you decode the sounds of the words by sounding them out, essentially. So this is hooked on phonics. This is also if you were taught to read phonetically, perhaps like in something like the Montessori system, this would be what you've learned. Graphemic reading is whole word reading, and that's where you've memorized the word. And you can do a combination of these. You might have whole word reading for words you already know, but then use phonological reading when you get to a word you're not familiar with. Reading initially depends on those phonological skills, and then depends on those graphemic skills as we go on. So in terms of reading disabilities, you can have a phonological deficiency where you have impairments with speech sounds awareness. And you can have an attentional deficiency where you can't easily shift your attention, maybe impaired in the sound frequency discrimination, and this might be in the association areas of the parietal lobe. You can also have a sensory deficiency. So Talal and colleagues looked at this and they said that individuals with reading disabilities need a longer interval between tones, between different tones if they're just listening to sounds, to discriminate, tell the two tones apart. So one of the ways you can remediate is to train sound discrimination. There's also what's called magnocellular theory, which is the idea that the deficit might originate in the magnocellular part of the visual system, which processes black-white vision and movement, and black-white is obviously what we typically see when we're reading, just like the slide on this page. So here is a graphic that shows that sound detection ability. Again, that people who are language impaired, have one of these disabilities, really struggle when the notes are closer together to get them more accurate. Motor deficiency. So this is a cerebellar theory, and the idea is that the cerebellum's cognitive functions include skills needed for reading. So there might be something about like the motor movements of your eyes, perhaps, that are problematic. So subpopulations of disabled readers display different of these deficits. It's probably a combination of all these explanations, to be perfectly honest. So in terms of imaging sound projection in normal and dyslexic subjects, this is the rapid process hypothesis. So people with dyslexia have a fundamental deficit in processing rapidly changing sounds that we just talked about. So Temple and College in 2003 actually did an fMRI study, brain scan study of people who had developmental dyslexia, so they've had it since birth, with normal controls. And normal controls actually showed different brain activation, in particular in the left prefrontal cortex to rapid auditory stimuli. So it was like this part of the brain that might process that just wasn't lighting up for those who had the dyslexia. They did find that they could train the people with dyslexia, and some of them did improve. So here you see what those sound signals look like and the fMRI responses. And so this little piece, I'm not sure whether you can see my mouse or not, but the little light lit up near the top of the unimpaired readers on diagram B, that's that left prefrontal cortex part that you just don't see light up in the readers with dyslexia. Now, how do we test for these? Ideally, we would do a neuropsychological evaluation. And this can be done by someone like a school psychologist, a neuropsychologist. In most cases, this doesn't get done, and that's really unfortunate. I can't tell you the number of people I saw when I was in grad school doing these type of evaluations who had been diagnosed from one questionnaire that took them 5 minutes to fill out. That's not how you should diagnose this. You should really engage in a good neuropsychological evaluation. So you can use an IQ test, you can use the WAIS and the Wyatt together, and that helps you compare things. There's also the ACID profile, where you look at arithmetic, coding, info, and digit span from the IQ test. And their mean IQ score is average. It's 100, right? But if you compare them to controls, they perform at chance on left-right differentiation tasks. Verbal fluency doesn't change unless they've had help to adapt to their dyslexia. And there are significant differences between adult controls and people with dyslexia on the body placement test. So here you see the ACID profile, and the orangish line there represents the control, and the teal line represents the learning disabled, or reading disabled in this particular case. So you see how much fluctuation there is, and also how much lower they are than the controls on these tasks. You can also look at performance comparison on these tasks. So here's that body task, and this is actually a study by Wishaw and Kolb, so your textbook's authors. And you'll see that kids are doing okay when they're less than 8 years old, but by the time you get to adolescence, the controls do almost double better, right, than the people with dyslexia. So now we're going to talk about the non-language related neurodevelopmental disorders. And these are things that, again, many children suffer from, and again, don't always have good answers as to why they exist. So we'll start with ADHD. The CDC reports behavioral problems and learning disabilities in 5% of children. As we've talked about, ADHD fits into that. And so the DSM has two main diagnostic criteria. And one thing I should say real quick is that once upon a time, this was just called ADD, attention deficit disorder. They added the H to recognize the problematic part of the hyperactivity, which is one of the criteria. So inattention is inability to focus. You might daydream, you might sort of zone out, harder to see behaviorally. And in fact, a lot of the girls who get ADHD have more of the inattention, and so they go undiagnosed, which can be really problematic for them academically. Now, in terms of the hyperactivity, this is the most common behavioral disturbance among children. There is a higher incidence in boys. There's a lot of sociocultural reasons why that is, I think. And there's a whole bunch of different causes. So some people think it might be brain damage, encephalitis, genetics, food allergies, lead concentrations, home and school environment, and then maybe some things going on in the frontal lobe and basal ganglia. How do we treat this hyperactivity? Really, the best way to do it is therapy. There are a lot of great behavioral therapies to treat this for the kid and their parents. It's really, really important to get the parents involved because you need to structure the home and school environment to help the kid out. And meds, things like Ritalin are stimulants that stimulate the prefrontal cortex to help the child inhibit from that hyperactivity. So a combination of therapy and meds is often the best way to do this with a good IEP in place at school. Now, cerebral palsy, a little bit less is known about this. The primary characteristic here is motor abnormalities, but you can have some cognitive impairments as well. So 3.5 per 1,000 births. About 10% don't need any special services, and 65% only occasional. So it's really only a quarter that end up needing special ed. So in terms of motor symptoms, about half end up with spasms, and then 25% end up thyroid, 10% show rigidity, and 10% are atopic. So it's associated with difficult labor and premature birth, also asphyxia during labor or after, once you're born. In terms of brain abnormalities, you have lesions in a whole bunch of different areas: the cortical spinal tracts, the basal ganglia, the brainstem, the cerebellum. So here are many of the potential causes of cerebral palsy, and clearly we don't just have one, right? So lots of different things can go on here. So it does seem like there are some hereditary aspects, some genetic aspects of this. Things like carbon monoxide poisoning, some sort of cerebral hemorrhage prenatally, problems, trauma perinatally, complications of birth, postnatally, having any kind of trauma, again, infections, toxins, all kinds of different things that can go on. So again, we don't have one explanation, and there are going to be multiple causes. They have increased volume of that cerebral spinal fluid. So we have shrinking of brain tissue around the ventricles, so your body's going to compensate by filling up those ventricles. And then there can also be obstruction of the flow of that cerebral spinal fluid that could result in the expansion of those ventricles, and maybe your body's overproducing it. You can insert this by inserting a valve to drain the excess CSF, but then you have a valve draining your CSF, which has all the potential for infection and so on those lines. All right, next we're going to talk about autism spectrum disorders. So these are children with no obvious focal cerebral disease, but who have impaired social interaction, often bizarre and narrow ranges of interests, and language and communication difficulties. Many have preserved intellect, although not all. So autism spectrum disorder is really the catch-all that's used for a lot of these disorders now. And you have mild to severe symptoms on these areas on a spectrum. So autism is more prevalent in boys, tends to develop between the ages of 1 and 3. One side note here, age 1 is when you get your first MMR vaccine, and so that's why people think that getting the MMR vaccine is related to autism. It's not. There have been hundreds of studies with thousands of subjects showing it's not. The original study that showed that relationship was retracted because the guy was really sketchy. Andrew Wakefield, he drew blood at his child's birthday party. Like, there's a party favor bag, right? He changed the dates on when people were diagnosed, when kids were diagnosed, so making it all look like they were diagnosed after their vaccine, when in fact some were diagnosed before. And people think he was this big anti-vaxxer, but in fact, he was doing this study so that he could get his own MMR vaccine out on the market that he would have profited from. So no, vaccines don't cause autism. Wanted to get that out there. It does seem to be partially genetic. There's some support that there might be a virus related to the cause. They tend to have a larger head and brain size than normal. Some neurons fail to develop normally. And there seem to be problems in the brainstem here as well. So Asperger's syndrome used to be a separate, distinct diagnosis, but under the DSM-5, this is not a diagnostic entity anymore. They would just be high-functioning autism spectrum disorder. This has been a problem for people who really identified with that Asperger's label. It was also a problem because when the DSM came out in 2013, anyone who was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome had to be re-diagnosed for insurance purposes at extra cost, obviously. So less severe than autism, they have precocious development of reading abilities, and sometimes people with Asperger's have savant syndrome, which is a narrow range of special ability. So it can be like musical genius, scientific genius. If anyone's ever seen the movie Rain Man, he can like memorize the phone book, things along that. And those can appear or disappear quickly as well. Fragile X is another autism spectrum disorder, this one's clearly genetically caused. It's characterized by facial abnormalities, and you have from mild to severe mental disabilities. It's associated with attention deficits, hyperactivity, anxiety, unstable moods, some problems with the dendrites, thin cortex, small caudate nucleus, larger ventricles. We see this more in boys and men because they only have one X chromosome. So if it is damaged, it carries this, they're more likely to get it. It is recessive, so girls would have to have two. Fetal alcohol spectrum syndrome. It has both physical and intellectual problems related to it. So you can see some of these physical issues here. In terms of brain abnormalities, they tend to be smaller brains with abnormal gyri, abnormal clusters of cells and misaligned cells in the cortex. They tend to have learning disabilities, low IQ, ADHD symptoms, social problems, can be mild and severe. It's very controversial how much alcohol is safe during pregnancy. In Europe, for example, women often drink a glass of wine a day without problem. Some studies have suggested that like one glass of alcohol a week can cause problems. This is very controversial. There's a lot of research and a lot of obviously strong feelings about this as well. One thing that doesn't get talked about a lot is that it can also cause fertility issues for men. And not only fertility issues, but developmental issues. So if the man has alcohol in his system, when intercourse takes place, that leads to the creation of a zygote that develops into a fetus eventually. There are actually problems based on that sperm having been subjected to alcohol that can lead to fetal developmental problems. So that's not something we talk about. A lot of people like to say that women of reproductive age should always think of themselves as pre-pregnant and never drink. Well, maybe men of reproductive age should do the same thing. Something very interesting to think about. I honestly just think we should go the other way and have good birth control in place. Now, what happens if you are an adult and you have these types of disorders? If you are given special training, especially as a child, recognized early, you tend to do pretty well. There are some really effective treatments for these different types of disorder, most of them behavioral. So in 1988, Spring did a study and looked at this, and he did find some problems. So they tend to dislike school, so they're not likely to go into college or graduate school. Their parents report more serious effects on social interaction, well-being, and happiness than the children do. The parents have, again, this sort of outside perspective, and they have less detailed childhood memories. So most manage to make adjustments and find jobs. They just might not be living up to their full potential.